Good day, you're watching Businessworld Live. I'm Danie, Laurel.
And I'm Delos Santos. Here are today's top stories. The world remembers the life and legacy of Queen Elizabeth II. The United Kingdom's longest-serving monarch dies at age 96.
No reprieve in sight for the local currency as the peso sinks to a fresh all-time low.
With the jobless rate falling to its lowest level since the onset of the pandemic, NEDA expects employment figures to further improve in the coming months.
And the Health Department says the optional wearing of face masks in outdoor settings will be implemented soon, possibly in a couple of days. We begin our broadcast with some global updates. Britain's new king, Charles III, expresses great sadness over the death of his mother, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, their country's longest reigning monarch. In a statement released by the Buckingham Palace, King Charles says his mother's death will be deeply felt by Britain and the Commonwealth, as well as countless people around the world. He adds that during this time of mourning, the royal family is comforted by the, quote, respect and deep affection in which the Queen was so widely held. The royal family earlier confirmed that Queen Elizabeth died peacefully at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. She was 96. Over in London, thousands have already gathered outside the Buckingham Palace to mourn the death of the Queen. There was a stunned silence as the flag was lowered to half-mast. The Queen, whose husband died last year, had been suffering from what Buckingham Palace called episodic mobility problems since the end of last year, forcing her to withdraw from nearly all of her public engagements.
Queen Elizabeth's 70-year reign took Britain from the age of steam to the era of the smartphone. Let's take a look back at her life and legacy in this report by Bloomberg's Caroline Hyde.
Queen Elizabeth II reigned during a period of unprecedented technological, social and political change. When she took the throne, there had been debate over whether her coronation should even be televised. By the time of her death, she'd recorded a comedy sketch for broadcast on Twitter.
Oh, really? Please.
Boom.
As head of state, she presided over the end of Britain's once mighty global empire and watched the United Kingdom's fractious exit from the European Union.
My government intends to work towards a new partnership with the European Union based on free trade and friendly cooperation.
Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was born in London on April 21st, 1926. At the age of 10, her father unexpectedly became king after her uncle abdicated, making his eldest daughter the heir apparent. In 1947, she married Prince Philip of Greece, and the following year, their son Charles was born. In 1952, upon the death of her father, Elizabeth became queen at the age of 25. Amid cultural and political upheaval in the second half of the 20th century, the monarchy's image in British society shifted dramatically. Moments of pageantry and spectacle, like the fairy tale wedding of Prince Charles and Lady Diana Spencer, were quickly soured by the unravelling of the marriage, and Elizabeth's perceived lack of empathy with her popular daughter-in-law. But Queen Elizabeth retained the nation's affection. A new generation of royals entered the scene, coming across as more in tune with the times. Although in the waning years of her life, controversy arose again over the family's relationship with Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, and her son Prince Andrew's association with the convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The final years of her reign saw domestic political turbulence too, as Scotland debated independence and Brexit reopened tensions over Northern Ireland. While she had no official say in government matters, the Queen met every week with Britain's Prime Minister for a confidential discussion. She worked with 15 Prime Ministers over 70 years of dedicated service. Caroline Hyde, Bloomberg.
Shifting gears now to some updates on the home front. The peso dropped to a fresh record low for the fifth straight trading day against the greenback. The local unit closed at 57.18 against the US dollar on Thursday, September 8th, inching down by 4.5 centavos. This is further down from the finish of 57.135 on Wednesday, September 7th.
The National Economic and Development Authority sees more jobs in the horizon for Filipinos as the country moves for the full reopening of the economy. Socioeconomic Planning Secretary Arsenio Balisacan says more income opportunities will blunt the effects of inflation on consumers' purchasing power. This comes after the country's jobless rate eased to its lowest since the onset of the pandemic. That's in July at 5.2%. Despite the drop in unemployment, job quality deteriorated as underemployment shot up to 13.8% in July from the 12.6% in June. The Employers Confederation of the Philippines says smaller businesses are struggling to compensate their employees as they are still reeling from the pandemic.
Yung quality of the job siya, talagang marami yung naghahati-hati. Pero mga nag-rotation provision ng mga kumpanya so that they can hire more people. Some of them gusto nila patrabahuin na lahat kahit paano. No? So ang ginagawa nila, pinapapasok na not necessarily full 7 days.
With 5 straight days of the peso posting record lows, how much lower can the currency go? And has a peso's purchasing power really eroded? Let's get insights from Businessworld columnist and Foundation for Economic President, political economist Calixto Chikiamco. Toti, thank you for joining us. Another all-time low for the peso. How do you see this playing out? Will it get worse before it gets better anytime soon?
Well, it could possibly get worse because I think the Federal Reserve has indicated that they'll do whatever they will have to do by increasing interest rates to contain U.S. inflation. So I think we will see it get worse before it gets better. It will be tempered somewhat in the last quarter because remittances from our OFWs start coming in.
Okay, sir, how related is this, not just to the Fed issue here and the rate hikes, but just to domestic issues as well and the trade deficit that we've seen ballooning to quite a record high?
Yes, of course, it because oil prices continue to remain high, and that's part of the reason. But I think a major reason really is the federal moves to increase interest rates.
Okay, sir, how big is the weaker peso's impact on inflation? Do we actually see this pushing, prices higher, especially for the price pressures here, as you mentioned, brought about by oil? And at what level can we say that, it's really deteriorated in terms of purchasing power? How much more pain is there for consumers?
Well, there'll be secondary effects because, of course, our oil imports are priced in dollars. No, but let's not forget that we trade with a lot of other countries, and and many currencies have depreciated against the U.S. dollar. Also, I mean, in fact, the peso has even become stronger against the Japanese yen. So if you are buying Japanese goods, it would not necessarily be more expensive, correct? So. I mean, there will certainly be a secondary effect primarily because of the impact of oil.
But do you think that at least these benefits or these gains are going to at least outweigh the downside? I mean, it's been said time and again, there are winners and losers in the currency's weakness. You have the likes of exports and OFWs, of course, gaining from this. But would that at least outweigh some of the downside?
Well, I think in the long term, yes, it will outweigh the downside because it will incentivize our exporters. Even our domestic manufacturers will benefit because that means their imported competition will become more expensive. And then, of course, there's OFWs increasing their purchasing power, and therefore this will help continue to propel the consumer-led economy.
Sir, do you agree with Governor Medalla when he says if you take a look at other emerging market currencies, the peso hasn't depreciated? That's what you mentioned earlier on. But when we look at the currency ranking, we're the third to the worst performing in Asia year to date, at the bottom of the rung. How do we reconcile these two facts or these two data?
Well, because of course, unlike other developing countries, our exports are as a percentage of our GDP is not so high, and of course, we are very much dependent on on oil or on oil imports. So that's the reason why I think our currency is depreciated. But we should not look at it in a negative light. As I said,
Okay.
there are many positive things to having a depreciated currency. In fact, other countries from China to Japan had used an undervalued currency to industrialize. So let's not panic and see that as the bellwether of the economy.
But sir, what level are you comfortable with? Because 57 is the weakest ever we've actually seen. How much weaker are you comfortable with in saying that this is actually okay to propel our export and manufacturing sectors?
Well, again, it depends on the secondary effect. If this leads to increases in oil prices and transport workers will demand increases, that it will depend on that level. I can't give you a precise figure, but certainly that's what the central bank is weighing in its decision to further increase interest rates. Whether there will be and how much will be the secondary effects of imported higher higher dollar rate, no?
Given that, how do you see at least the central bank acting?
I think they're going to have to increase interest rates if the U.S. increases its rates again. So I think they'll probably have to match it because again, we can't escape the fact that the Federal Reserve is the global central bank. Whatever they do, it affects. As they said, if the U.S. sneezes, everybody catches a cold.
Let's shift the discussion over a bit. This time, of course, yesterday employment figures came out. Unemployment is, but you have more underemployed Filipinos. How should we read into this, especially at a time, of course, that we're dealing with hot inflation?
Well, it's due to the fact that I think we're normalizing because of pandemic restrictions are in fact beginning to ease. They're even talking about removing the mask mandate, and that's the reason. But I wouldn't put too much significance on that. Employment, you're considered employed if you have worked 1 hour the past week. That's the official definition of employment. So what the more significant for me is unemployment and underemployment. And here we are still about nearly a quarter of our labor force. So I wouldn't put too much significance on that, except to say that this means that we're beginning to normalize in terms of our economic activity.
Sir, what's the real deal in terms of growth? You have, President BBM saying we're Asia's fastest rising tiger or star. Na, hindi na pala tiger. Star. But when you look at the figures, the second quarter GDP came down lower than the first quarter, lower than analysts had expected. We have had some downgrades for the full year. So what's the real outlook here? Are we growing better than expected, as expected, or worse than we were hoping for from the beginning of the year?
Well, it's probably worse than we were hoping for because of these geopolitical events like the Ukraine war and of course the increase in oil prices. Those have been affecting our growth picture. So, the real question is whether this growth rates can be sustained. Because part of the reason for our higher figures, of course, we came from a lower base. Remember, during the pandemic, we had I think the biggest contraction here in Asia. So the question is whether we can maintain, as what they said, to have about 6 to 7% growth for the next 6 years.
Okay, and will we see that above 6% growth, sir, given the reopening of the economy in the second semester?
again, depends on the reforms that the government's going to do. And part, of course, is what happens internationally.
Okay.
It's hard to say because, for example, the OPEC just cut its production, and therefore there's a slight increase in oil prices. So it's really hard to say. But again, I think what worries me more is really the inflation picture. Although we said that we already peaked at 6.3%, I'm worried about the food inflation. That the food shortages will continue, in fact, become worse in the last quarter of the year as demand picks up and the supply problems magnify, especially in the light of reluctance of the government to increase importation of food.
Okay, so still inflation, the big boogeyman here, and as you mentioned, the oil prices not yet abating. Thank you so much, Toti Chikiamco, President of the Foundation for Economic Freedom and columnist over at Businessworld. Thank you, sir.
Now let's pause for a quick break, but coming right up after that. Meralco is increasing its power rates for this month due to higher generation charges caused by a weaker peso.
More of that and other stories when Business World Live returns. Stay with us.
You're still watching Business World Live here on One News. I'm Jess De Los Santos.
And I'm Danie Laurel.
Trade data coming in fresh from the PSA. The country's export sales contracted by 4.2% in July from a 1% growth in June. Data from the PSA shows that the country's total export sales in July amounted to $6.2 billion in July. That's from $6.6 billion the month before. Imports, meanwhile, amounted to $12.14 billion, increasing at a rate of 21.5%. This indicates an annual increase of 69.1% in trade deficit, amounting to $5.93 billion. Meanwhile, the PSA has also reported that manufacturing slowed in July after coming from a high base a year ago. Preliminary data shows that factory output grew by 2.5% year-on-year in July, but drastically slower than 534% in the same month last year. Still, July's figure was higher than the revised 0.7% growth in June. Factory output averaged 24.1% in the first 7 months of the year. PSA attributed the July factory growth to the annual growth seen in 17 out of 22 industry divisions, led by fabricated metal products and machinery and equipment except electrical.
Face masks outdoors will no longer be mandatory in the coming days as the government prepares to implement optional mask wearing. Now, in an interview with the chiefs, DOH officer in charge Maria Rosario Verger says the agency is just waiting for an official order from Malacanang before implementing the new rule. The DOH and the palace have earlier said that President Bongbong Marcos has verbally approved the easing of the mask mandate.
We only start formal or official implementation and this becomes official once it is in a legal instrument of it. It's going to happen soon. So it's within a couple of days maybe, pag lumabas na po yung EO, it's going to happen.
Now, a business leader believes the option should also be made available for indoor spaces. The Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry President George Barcelon says Filipinos are responsible enough to know whether or not they need the added layer of protection.
The conditionalities depende sa tao na yon. Halimbawa, earlier I said, kung alam nila may sakit sila, may comorbidity, dapat nakamas sila. I think people now are responsible enough. When they know that they have to, on certain circumstances, they have to have that extra protection, voluntarily, they should wear the mask.
Heads up, Meralco customers expect to pay more for electricity this month as the power distributor hikes power rates on the back of the weaker peso. Typical households consuming 200 kilowatt hours will get billed higher by 78 pesos. That's equivalent to 9 pesos and 9,936 centavos per kilowatt hour, higher than the 9 peso and 5,458 per kilowatt hour in August. Meanwhile, monthly power bills for homes that consume 300 to 400 and 500 kilowatt hour will go up by 117 pesos, 156 pesos, and 195 pesos respectively. Aside from the stronger dollar, Meralco says ongoing gas supply restrictions from the Malampaya gas field also contributed to the increase in electricity rates.
Transport groups are calling on government to look into ride-hailing company Grab's acquisition of motorcycle taxi firm Move It. According to the National Public Transport Coalition, the acquisition implies that Grab is entering the motorcycle taxi service, which is still in its pilot testing phase. At present, the only companies permitted to join the pilot testing are Move It, Angkas, and Joyride. Grab, however, clarifies that it has consulted with the LTFRB, the Philippine Competition Commission, and other concerned agencies regarding the acquisition. Move It also says that it did not hand over its accreditation for the pilot testing to Grab.
And those are the biggest stories on the economic and corporate front today. I'm Jess Delos Santos.
And I'm Danie, Laurel. We are One News, all sides, all the time. But don't go away. We'll give you the latest on the local bourse when Business World Live returns. Stay with us.
And they're still watching Businessworld live here in One News. Now, Dan, for better or for worse, it's the end of an era over in the United Kingdom. Is there a reaction over the equity space?
You know, a very interesting question there, Jess, because there is, of course, the mourning that is going on, but there's a larger picture, which is, of course, the head of the Commonwealth is now changing hands, of course, to the King, Charles, right now. But apart from that, there's also still tensions going on, even during the last days of the late Queen. You have, of course, the separatists in Northern Ireland, Europe unwinding, the Brexit, of course, and the ties between the UK and Europe. And then she had also just endorsed Liz Truss as Prime Minister, which is still in the Conservative Party, of course, but replacing Boris Johnson 2 days ago. So a lot of things going on in the political arena. And if you take a look at the stocks, I mean, I did want to show how European stocks have been doing year to date amid, apart from this, a lot of crises, particularly the energy crisis over in the EU. EU stocks down by 18.3%. If you take a look at the FTSE 100, which are, of course, the UK stocks, it's actually the least hit year to date. It's down by 1.7%. Now, over just to our own index, seeing how we are performing. Finally, a bit of a reprieve here after a couple of days of pain. So up by 0.3%, back above 6,600 levels. Of course, we have had cautious comments from the Fed saying basically that they're determined to have to curb those price pressures over in the US, and bets are now on for a 75 basis points move. Let's take a look at the big movers here of the day. I just want to show that our index is down 7.4% year to date. Still better, so to speak, than European stocks. And if you take a look at some of the movers here, very mixed picture. Converge leading the charge here, up by 1.9%. SM Investments as well as BPI, Jess.
Okay, some reprieve at least for the main index, but let's take a quick look at the peso. I mean, we had Toti Chikiamco earlier saying it's bound to get worse before it gets better, and especially on the back of those trade figures, how is the currency doing?
Surprisingly, Jess, especially given the fact that the trade figures, show that wider deficit than expected. Apart from that, exports contracting by more than 4% year on year when the expectation was it would grow by 2%. Nevertheless, maybe it's felt so much pain already in the past couple of days. It's actually strengthened a touch, closing in at least, closing further below 57 at 57.018 to the greenback. And I did want to add as well, this on the back of dollar reserves slipping to the lowest level we've seen in 2 years as of the end of August. So we're at $98.98 billion. That's 8.3% lower than a year ago. And the central bank has said that's because they've repaid some debt and, of course, lower valuation of the central bank's gold holdings. This, according to Mike Ricafort from RCBC, the decline in the GIR is correlated with the weaker peso. So something else to watch out for here. Do we have enough cover for our imports, Jess?
Okay, let's see if the peso gets to maintain that and end the week on a better note. That's it for today, September 9, 2022. Join us again tomorrow or Monday at exactly 9:30 a.m. You can also catch us on Signal Play. Register for a free account now at www.signalplay.com and stream One News Live anytime, anywhere. I'm Jess Delos Santos.
Yeah, no broadcast tomorrow because everyone needs to rest. It's Friday. I'm Danie, Laurel. Mask on, wash hands, stay safe, Philippines. We are One News, all sides, all the time.